Hey there YouTube, my name is Brad, I'm the Harley Davidson Wizard. Today we have a 2008 Ultra Classic, and what's going on with it is the lower rocker box gasket's leaking oil, especially the rear one. We're going to do both of them because that's just a smart idea. It's a pretty popular, especially early twin cams. Early twin cams had just a metal gasket in between the whole rocker box assembly, and newer models have a rubberized metal gasket, but they're still kind of popular as far as leaking. What happens typically is the bike gets really hot, it cooks the rubber seal a little bit, and then since the rubber seal is compromised, then oil is able to skip past there. A lot of times what happens is the screws start to loosen up a little bit because it loses the clamping pressure when the rubber is compromised. So we're going to pop it apart. I'm going to show you a couple things that I do specifically as far as, I guess, tips and tricks if you're doing this, or if you're just interested in seeing the valve train and how we go about taking it apart, putting it back together. But that's going to be what we're doing. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the spark plugs out on the left side. The spark plugs are only on the left side, but they're over there. So we're going to pull the spark plugs out. We're going to put it in 6th gear, and I'm going to pop the gas tank off and the seat off, and then I'll bring you back. Now that we got the gas tank and the seat off, let me bring you in for a closer look on that oil leak. And we already wiped down the backbone. We want to get any of the loose dirt that's on there, get that off, because we're going to be pulling the rocker boxes, and we don't want any type of crap to fall in there. But let's take a look. So this motorcycle came in for a service, and while doing the service, I saw that it was leaking oil. You can see that it's wet. Let me see. You can see where it's wet all up in there and over by the spark plug. Here it's probably easiest to see that it's leaking oil and it's kind of running out of here. This is what it looks like in its very early stages. A lot of times if this goes unmissed, you get a lot of oil where it kind of runs back, and I've seen it where it runs down the back of the exhaust system and everything, and you can definitely smell it cooking. But we're going to get these upper rocker box covers off. There's nothing to them really. These are just 7/16 screws. So we're going to pull both of those off and take a look at what we got going on under that. So now that we have all the screws out of the rocker boxes, that one's going to stay there. Now that we have all the screws out of it, we just need to break the seal. Sometimes it's really easy, and you can, like if it's a newer bike, you can just kind of bop it with your palm. But since this thing is older and these things are baked on, we're going to use a dead blow hammer. I've had this thing forever, but it's just a plastic hammer, so it doesn't scratch or mar anything. It's a dead blow hammer, and you just give it just a little bit, and that's it. You can hear once they're ready to come off. You kind of just wiggle it around a little bit. This back one is a bit of an unusual setup since it has a modified air cleaner and a modified breather tube. But basically when there's nothing in its way, it just comes up and jiggles out. And that's it. I'm going to do that to the front and move you to a different angle. So we've got the upper rocker box covers off. Now these gaskets, these have like I was talking about, these have a metal core, and then they're coated in rubber. They're sharp as shit, so be careful because they will cut your hand wide open. And they're usually stuck on pretty well. At least the bottom ones are, that are going to be under this lower rocker box cover. We're going to be replacing all of these gaskets, so you toss them. These are earlier style breathers. We're going to be putting newer ones in that are, like, these are cast aluminum. And the newer ones they function identically, but they're made out of stamped steel. And they have a lower profile to them, so it's much easier to get in here and service and tighten these bolts down in the future if somebody needs to get in here and, I don't know, put a new cam or something in it or take it back apart. But that's what we're going to do first. We're going to loosen up and fully loosen up these 5/16 screws here in the center. We don't want any pressure from the valve springs to be pushing against the tiny screws that are holding this down. We're going to have 4 1/2-inch screws, 2 here, and then 2 in the back. Likewise in the front, 2 here, 2 in the back. And then these little 5/16 screws. So we're going to loosen those up and make sure that they're fully released. That way we aren't putting any unusual pressure through their threads. So let's do that. All right, I just said these are 5/16. Scratch that from the record. They are 3/8. I knew that, but I just had a brain fart. These are a 3/8 screw. So we're going to remove these 3/8 screws and then bring it back. All right, now that we have the breather screws completely loosened, these older ones, they're a real pain in the butt if you try to, like, replace the individual breather itself while it's in the frame here. So what we're going to be doing is removing these other 1/2-inch bolts that hold the rocker arm support plate down and then sliding the thing out as an assembly. So before we start loosening these bolts, we want to make sure that we get the cam on its base circle so that the push rods are at their lowest point and that the rocker arms aren't trying to open the valves. So we want to work on this cylinder, but we're going to look over here at this cylinder to get it on its base circle. So hopefully that comes in view. But what we're going to look for is for the exhaust valve to open and shut, and then the intake valve to just begin to open. It will look like a little deal like that. And then that will mean that this cylinder is on overlap. And that will mean that our other cylinder is ready to be disassembled. But let me show you that. So I'm just spinning the rear wheel right now. That's why we have it in 6th gear where the spark plugs out. Alright, so the exhaust valve is opening. And then the intake valve is just about to open there. So this cylinder is on overlap. And when we go back and take a look at this other cylinder, the rear cylinder that we're working on, it doesn't matter, you know, where you start at, whether it's the front or the back, but I like to start it on the back. And we're going to confirm that the valves are not trying to be opened, because essentially when this set of cam lobes is on the base circle, that means that the lobes are at their lowest point. So that essentially they aren't going to be trying to open a valve. And the way that we confirm that is you'll be able to grab the rocker arm and move it back and forth. Hopefully that's coming through. You can kind of hear it clicking a little bit. And then the same with the intake. So now we're 100% guaranteed that this cylinder is ready for us to remove these screws. So there's still going to be a little bit of tension on them because the rocker arm is pushing on the push rod, and the push rod is depressing the plunger and the lifter just a little bit. That's the way hydraulic lifters work. So there's going to be just a little bit of spring pressure from the lifter on these assemblies. And there's going to be a little bit of oil in there too, but so we want to bring these screws out evenly. So you just kind of crack them loose, and then I go like a couple turns here, a couple there, and then back and forth, back and forth. So I'm going to get doing that, and we'll bring it back. all of our screws are loose. We're going to get this tube you won't have in your situation typically. The customer added this to the air cleaner, so instead of the oil coming from the breathers being ingested back into the engine and being burned, it just kind of dumps it to the ground. But let's get that out of the way. Sometimes it can be a bit of a hassle to wrestle out of this position. If you have like a 2006 and earlier model, usually you have to go between a top engine mount or top stabilizer link with a pry bar and kind of push the engine down up against its motor mounts a little bit. But this is a slightly newer motorcycle. I think I said in 2008, so we likely don't have to do that, but just kind of lift up, make sure all your screws are loose and free, and then your back ones usually kind of try to sit in the holes a little bit. Alright, and then you finagle the assembly out of the vehicle. So we're going to go put this one on the bench, and then we don't want to get too excited and pull the front apart because remember we have it on overlap. So we're going to feel the push rods here. Obviously this is exhaust push rod, this is intake push rod. So I keep my fingers on them as I turn the rear wheel over. And there the intake is opening. Actually I just messed it up. Let's keep going. There, the exhaust just opened. Now it's going to go down and the intake is just beginning to open itself. So let's go take a look at the front and make sure that she's ready to come apart. Sorry, I keep bumping the camera. So here you can hear it and you can see the rocker arm moving back and forth, so there's no pressure on it, along with the exhaust push rod or the exhaust rocker arm. So now we're going to bring out these 4 screws and get this rocker arm assembly out. So we removed all the screws. Well, we loosened them all up so that they're all free. And now this rocker arm assembly will slide right out as well. There's a little O-ring right here to seal the breather passage. I always pull it out at this point and toss it in the garbage so it doesn't accidentally get reassembled. I've seen where people leave the O-ring in there and then they put another O-ring, like another new O-ring on top of it and squish it and mess it all up. I've seen where people don't get it in the groove. Like they pulled the rocker arm assembly off and this was stuck to the bottom of it, but then when we put it back together, reusing the old O-ring, it was cocked off to the side and like it got pinched and everything. So I always use new gaskets because at the dealership they're right upstairs. It's no big deal. There's no reason for me to risk or compromise a job when a customer is paying for it, you know. So I get this one, I get the other one, and then I'm going to toss them in the garbage. And since we're already here at the front, we're going to pull off the 6 screws. These are 7/16 screws as well, and get this rocker box and get the bolts out of it and the bolts out of the other one. And then we're going to come back, and these are going to require a little bit more persuasion with the dead blow to get them off, but here we go. Alright, so we pulled the screws, we unscrewed all 6 screws to hold this lower rocker box down. So the first thing that we want to make notice of is that there's oil on the threads. So oil, there isn't a seal here, it's just a metal washer. So oil is able to get down under this washer and then sit down into this hole. So we want to be aware that since there's oil on the threads, there's going to be oil in that hole. So I'll show you the way that I clean these bolt holes out, but you definitely have to, you don't have to actually clean out the threads, but that's what I do. I get in there and I clean all of the oil out, because I've seen where people have just run these screws back in, and I've seen where it's even cracked like through the fin down here, where you're compressing all that oil, making all of that hydraulic pressure, and where it fractures the head way down here. And that's no good. It's I'll show you the way that I clean it out. It's very simple. The ones that break the most often that I hear about are these two screws here, and that's where the breather bolts went all the way down. The casting is very shallow as far as like at the very bottom of this bolt hole. There's just a little bit of aluminum like covering it. So it's really easy to build up a bunch of pressure there and crack out the bottom. But now that we got the screws out of it, we'll get them out of there. We're going to take our dead blow hammer. I like to try to aim for this area here. Not that this has ever marred or scratched or scuffed a surface, but you can't see this part at all while the gas tank is on. So rather than, trying to get in there and get crazy, right on the edge, if you have a different type of tool, it might mar that surface, so be careful. But this is how I do it. I felt it move that last little hit, so you don't have to get crazy with it and like wait for the metal pieces to all bounce off each other. You can feel it once it breaks the seal. Just trying to break the surface of the gasket. Alright, and that's what a beautiful gasket looks like. So this one hasn't actually started leaking yet, but usually once the rear typically does it, because I'm assuming of heat, the front is probably easier to cool off around here a little bit. The rear probably gets cooked up, but the rears typically start leaking and then the fronts do. So we already have the tank off. It's only a little bit more labor time to do both of them. It's going to be great. It's going to be fresh. But on the other one, we'll probably see a problem right in this area. So let's pop the rear one off and see what we see. So for these last two screws way back here by the valve springs, I'm going to be using this special tool. It's called a rocker box wrench, and I bought it out of the Screamin' Eagle catalog. It used to say Screamin' Eagle on it, but it's just a 3/16 Allen socket bit that fits in the little recess in the bolts for the rocker boxes. I like this tool because it's one piece. You just stick it in there and do the deal with it. You don't have to worry about the bit falling out because it's pretty well attached in there. So let's get over there and get those bolts out. Alright, we got all the bolts out. The last thing I'm going to do, since I'm standing on this side of the bike, I'm going to put the spark plugs back in for this time, just so none of the junk will fall down into the cylinder. Seems like a good idea. So I'm just going to pop the plugs in. Now that we have the spark plugs in and all the screws out, I'm going to go to the other side and tap it around a little bit. Actually, hold on, I'm just going to move the camera. That seems like a smarter idea. So we're just going to give it some good firm taps until you feel it. Like you can feel that you're hitting something and it's standing still, and then you can feel it kind of just give a little bit, and that's the gasket. That's what we're going for. All right. I'm going to go free up the gasket on the other side. All right. And then it will come right out. It usually comes out without having to take a push rod out. So, yeah. All right. So right here we can see that the gasket, you can just tell by the dirt that's on there that the gasket was compromised all through here. This isn't that bad. A lot of times I pull these up and like it's just a whole bunch of dirt that's like packed in there just from the oil. But the next thing that we need to do is clean up our cylinder head surfaces, because there's no point in putting a new gasket on if you just have a crappy gasket, you know, a crappy spot for it to sit. So that's what we're going to do. So the main way that I typically clean up this surface is I just use a red Scotch-Brite. We get them in these big rectangles. I just cut it with a pair of scissors. And these are just like cheapy scissors. Nothing fancy about it. Cut them in little squares like this. And then you want to be careful that you aren't like scraping stuff into the actual like passages of the engine. But if you do it very carefully, you can kind of, let me see if I can get you in closer. You can like scrape in an outward direction, which is against, because all these little rubber ridges, if you scrape in like an opposite direction, they just kind of come out faster, or just, it helps it come off faster. So that's basically what I'm going to do. I'm going to sit here and scrub this whole surface until there is no more rubberized gasket left on there. So I'll bring you back when I do that. Alright, so now is probably the most important part. We're going to clean out the threads. Now, this hasn't been apart before, so the threads aren't packed full of Loctite. If you see a bunch of like blue crap kind of like hanging out of it, that means somebody else has been in it. And you should definitely go through it with a thread chaser. But this isn't that type of situation. What we're going to use is a brake cleaner with a long red tip on it. That's going to allow us to get down to the bottom of that hole, blast the cleaner down in the bottom, and push all that oil and crap up and out. But we don't want it to just like roll into the engine. So we're going to take a lint-free rag, and I hold it up like, say we're going to be working this back hole here. So then I cover everything up, get down in there, that one doesn't have much in it, just a few little specks of crap. Let's find like the front one here that had oil in it. So here's a clean part of the towel, and then it's an unusual situation around the camera here. Let me get to the other side of the bike. Alright, clean part of the towel. We've got the engine covered. Take your tube, stick it down to the bottom. Now that everything's clean there, we're going to take our blowgun and do the same thing. Cover it up, stick it down in there, and blow all of the cleaner and the oil out of it. Until it comes out looking amazing. You can tell the difference between the oil. There's still a little bit of gasket on there. You can tell the difference between the oil and the cleaner when it's blowing out of there. Let's get this next one. That's probably going to be a good one too. See all that oil? Well, hopefully you can see all that oil. And then let's blast out what's in there. When it comes out like a volcano where it's like a thick white, that is the oil mist coming out of there. Alright, so I'm going to do that to every single one of these holes. That exact same process. And then we're going to go over to the bench and show the new parts that we have. But this is a super important part of the repair. Clean out all of the bolt holes. Make sure there isn't any oil in there. And nothing else. Very important. Alright, so since we have all of the holes blown out, I got a little brake cleaner on that lint-free towel. We want to go over, and if you missed any of the rubber that was left over from the old gasket, you can give it just a little bit of pressure and it'll pull right out of there. But I like to make sure that the gasket surface is totally free and dry of any type of oil or poop. Looking good there. Let's get to this back one. Just go over every surface. So we're all done with this. Here are the new gaskets. They're essentially the same ones as the old ones that we pulled off the motorcycle, but these ones are new. These are the best ones that I've ever come across, is the original Harley Davidson ones. I've seen where like James and other people make rocker box gaskets, and they've always sucked. I've never had good experiences with any of them. But the bottom one here, it's important to note that this says front head. And then if you flip it over, it says rear head. So this is a passageway for the breather that in the rear head, it needs to be facing up where it says rear head so that the breather passage orientation is correct. And then once you put it on the front head, it'll be the other way. So it's actually the same gasket, it just goes in both spots. These are the new breathers that we were talking about and how they're stamped steel. They function the exact same way as the aluminum, the cast aluminum ones that we pulled out, but they have a shallower design height to them, so they're easier to put in, and it has the new gaskets on it anyways. So for the couple dollars that you pay more for the new kit, with all this stuff. It comes with new gaskets, and these gaskets are a pain in the ass to scrape off anyways. But so you put your umbrella valve in from the top, push it through, make sure that it's seated, and then you take your oil separator, stick it in from the bottom, scrunch it in there, and then you put its little hat on. Bing, bang, boom. So that one's ready to fit right in the rocker box assembly. And the fronts and the back are both the same part numbers again, but same thing. Umbrella valve goes in from the top. Make sure it's seated, and then this is a oil air separator. Squishes into the bottom. It's probably hard to tell since I've already squished it in, but you can see the gasket has like a little flat there, a flat there, and a flat there to retain that little thing. Put its top on. It's important to notice that these screws are different lengths in between this new steel setup and the older aluminum setup, because the older aluminum setup is taller. It comes with longer screws, so you don't want to mess that up. But let's go take a look at the rocker arms themselves. Here we have the rocker arm assemblies. This is front and rear. I always put them on the table, so like front's always front, rear's always in the back, because that's how the vehicle is positioned on the hoist. So then I don't have to worry about like how things go back together. Likewise, this is front, back, but if you're really lucky and you've caught it early and you haven't baked this shit out of the engine, you can usually take these two bolts and pop them sideways, and it'll come up cleanly with the gasket intact. That way we just have to clean up this little surface and pop the new breather assembly in. Let's see if we got lucky here. Maybe, oh. That's usually what happens is once they start getting hot and baked, and where it's baking the rubber part of the gasket, then these seals get super just like burned into here. And when they do that, I usually take a gasket scraper, scrape up what I can, and then I pull out these two bolts, and then I use one to push the little rocker arm shaft out, and that's how the little assembly comes out. And then you can take this, and I use just like a razor blade and start cutting away at it, because the gasket is so freaking hard. And then in the very end, if I need to like smooth it out, I use the special conditioning wheel or whatever. It's really easy on aluminum surfaces, but you don't want to get in here with like sandpaper and get crazy. And then you put your rocker arms right back in. But we got lucky on this. I like being lucky. So let's go over and take a look at our lower rocker box gaskets. So we made sure that we got the O-rings out of here, and likewise there. Flip it over. Take a gasket, toss it in the garbage. Leave it just like that. Same with the rear one. Likewise, just like that. Same thing with your little Scotch brake pad. You want to be careful when you're Scotch braiding it that you don't like roll over the edge and get crazy, because this is a visual part. You'll see this edge of it when it's on a motorcycle. Obviously you don't see the bottom, but that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through and clean up all of these edges, and then flip the tops over because they have a little bit of a residue left on there too, and then do that to all the tops. And then I'm going to take them over to there's a wash tank over in the corner over there. But then I spray every hole out and the surface. I want to get all of the oil off of here. So when I blow dry it clean, it will also be dry, because the oil will hold on to all these little particles of crap. And you don't want the crap in your engine. So I go and I just rinse it all off basically with a brake cleaner, and then hit it with the compressed air. And then you also want to be conscious that there's threads in here too. So I go in there and likewise, clean out the threads, make sure the threads are nice and clean, and then I'll bring it back and we'll do the reassembly. So let me bring you into view here. So it probably only took about 15 minutes, but we've cleaned up the rocker boxes. You see that they're oil free now, and they're nice and clean on the backside. Want to have a clean backside. Same with the rocker boxes, that they are oil free and everything's been cleaned out. Same with the rocker arms. I just lightly clean them just to get the oil off, because you don't want to have like oil buildup here and here, because that's gonna, that could potentially mess up how this machined area fits in this machined area. Technically it's that one, but you just want to make sure that the things that fit up next to other things are nice and clean, and that way you won't have any problems with reassembly. Cleaned up the hardware, so I just took them over to the wire wheel, buzzed them on that. Same thing, I used the brake cleaner to get the grease off of them, or the oil, because we're going to be using blue Loctite. You can use whatever brand you want. This is the type I have. And you want the threads to be clean, the holes to be clean that are in the cylinder heads, so that not only do we get the nice tight correct torque spec and we don't blow out any holes in the cylinder heads, but that the Loctite itself also has the best chance to set up correctly and keep all this nice and tight. So we did the rocker arm support plate bolts, they fit in there. And likewise, I cleaned out even the passageway of this hole so it wouldn't get oil on the threads as it goes through. Just small attention to detail usually makes all the difference in the world, It probably only took me 10 or 12 minutes to do all of this, clean all of this up, wash my hands, crack open a pop. But the next thing is you want to make sure that you don't mess up your bolts, from the top bolts to the bolts that fit on the inside of the rocker boxes, because these long ones are the same length. You see, they are the exact same bolt, but the difference is that this one's been outside an engine for, I'm doing the math right off the top of my head, I should have thought about this, for 12 years this bolt's been outside the engine, and for 12 years this one's been inside the engine. So this one is nice and clean. You should leave it inside the engine so that it doesn't fit there. It fits right there, so that you aren't introducing new levels of dirt and crap into your engine. Just throwing that out there. This one would probably be pretty obvious not to put this one inside the engine, but just keep that in mind while you're doing it. If you keep the inside bolts inside and the outside bolts outside, that's cool, And then I like to clean out the little holes, or the little hexes on the inside too, because as I'm handling this and taking it to the wire wheel, crap can fall in there, and you don't want crap in the engine. If you disassemble the rocker arm support plate, obviously you want to oil the rocker arm shaft and then the thrust surfaces here and here. We didn't do a complete disassembly on this, so there's still oil on the inside, and also on the thrust surfaces, so that's all good to go. But when I do put it back together, I may not mention it, but I will put assembly lube actually on the tip of the valve tip where this contacts, and then I'll put assembly lube on the push rod where it contacts the rocker arm up there, because these things are going to be moving around for a few seconds before oil pressure gets up through the push rod up through here. So you'll see that as I'm putting it back together. But everything is done. We're ready to put it on the motorcycle, and let's get to it. We already know that our front cylinder is still ready to go because we started at the back, got that one on the base circle, undid all of that rocker arm, all of that business. Then we did the front. So it's easy enough to double check, and we'll pull the spark plugs back out because we'll eventually have to roll this cylinder back over, but we know that this cylinder was the last one that we took apart, so it's going to be the first one that we put back together. Then we don't have to spin things back around. So we're going to get our new gasket, this boy. I'm holding things in my other hand, so it's unusual, but you'll see how it says front head, hopefully right there. Actually, let me put this stuff down. Alright, you'll see how it says front head there, and that's because this raised embossed area is made to seal off this chamber. So that is why it's important that you put it on in the correct direction. I usually do both the front and the back at the same time. Well, for this gasket at least, you know. You just drop it in there. Front, rear. And then you get your lower rocker arm or rocker box cover. Put that right there. Now put the rear up. Just like that. And then I'm going to put the Loctite on the screws and put these 6 screws in the front, also in the rear. Blue Loctite on them. And you torque them down to 168 inch-pounds. So I'm going to do that. Alright, before you just start cranking down all of these 6 bolts, let me show you this little deal. So this is just the bolt that's normally in here with the rocker arm support plate, but you can tell, see like how the bolt's moving? You can tighten this whole plate down like slightly cattywampus, and then it makes it really difficult, and you're binding and binding and binding the screw up trying to get it in, and it makes for a few aluminum shavings down there along with a incorrect torque reading. So what I like to do is just kind of move this thing around a little bit, and you'll kind of find like where its center is, and then just start a couple bolts, kind of go both, you know, front and back as far as you can, find the center, and then top and bottom, find the center, and then you get the bolts started to hold it there. And then as we're going to go through and torque these down, but as we're putting the rocker arm support plate bolts in, these 4, if we feel anything funny, we can easily loosen these back up while that's still in there, and then fully tighten the rocker arm support plate bolts, and then go back and tighten these. But you only do that if you have to. So right now everything's looking good. We got the bolts, we got this kind of centered up around where the bolts are, so that's looking good. So I'm just going to run all these in and torque them down. So we've got everybody all torqued down. Everything's looking good. Before I put the assembly lube on, let's put our O-rings in so we don't forget. You just fit in there. Bloop, just like that. Easy peasy. No big deal. And then I get Screaming Eagle assembly lube. This stuff. You can find it at your nearest Harley Davidson dealership. It's super thick, as you'll see. Like, you can see how thick that stuff is. I'll put a little bit right on the tip of the valve stem. And then a little bit just right around. It's very stringy, so that's why I'm doing like all this weird like movement with my fingers, because I don't want the stringiness to get everywhere. But that way it will prevent those parts that are currently dry and free of oil. It'll prevent them from galling or whatever when the engine first starts spinning. But keep them happy is what I'm talking about. I just do them all because it's so messy, you know. I'd rather getting it all over the place here. There we go. All right, now let's go on up. Now let's get the rocker arm support plate in there. All right, I find it easiest to put the bolts in. Well, first I put the Loctite on, then I slide the bolts through the rocker arm support plate. And then earlier we assembled the breather setup, and it already has a lock patch on those screws. Then you just drop it in there and then slide the whole thing in as a assembly. And then your push rods should just drop right into the pocket of the rocker arms, but just be aware that that should be happening if it's not. And then I like to get all of the screws started, because sometimes you can get the rocker arm where it's compressed down and everything, and then these bolts are kind of bound up for the breather. So now it's really just the opposite of what we did before. We're going to tighten these down evenly so it draws down evenly through the rocker arm support plate, and then we will tighten the breather screws up last. But these are 18 foot-pounds, so like I said, evenly. I'm just going to run them down, then tighten them down evenly until I can fully torque them to 18 foot-pounds. Come back and run these breather screws in. Now that we have the rocker arm support plate bolts torqued down, 18 foot-pounds, like I was saying, we want to wait till the lifters have bled down. As far as how long it's going to take, that varies. But the one right answer is, as far as when is a good time to turn the engine over, is once it's bled down. The way to double check that, like we did earlier, we'll push back and forth on the rocker arm. And you can't move them yet, so it's not bled down. But that won't stop us from tightening the breather screws down. The torque spec for these is 120 to 156 inch-pounds. I always do them to 140 inch-pounds. It's good enough. But same thing, you want to kind of roll one side in and then come to the other side and bring her in evenly. just like that. Get your torque wrench out. 140. All right, perfect. And then we'll double check. They're not ready yet. The lifters haven't fully bled down yet. So we got the can of Diet Mountain Dew we opened up. It's getting warm. We're gonna go take a break and suck that thing down. All right, it's probably been about 15 minutes. I went upstairs and peed, cleaned up things around my bay a little bit, came back, and then I don't know if you can hear it or see it through my hands, but now the rocker arm is sliding back and forth, so it doesn't have tension on it. And likewise with the front, same thing. It doesn't have tension on it, so that's good. That means everything's bled down. The last thing I do, which again, isn't really vital or necessary or anything, I have fresh oil in this can. And I just shoot a little all over that valve spring. And that's it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do just like we did earlier. We're going to roll this over until this cylinder is on overlap. That will mean the other cylinder will be on base circle, and then we can put that other rocker arm assembly back in there. Keep on going. All right. There we go. The exhaust is open. Shut, and then the intake is just about to open. That means that our rear push rods are at their lowest point. So since it's basically, actually, I was going to skip through it, but we're already here, we might as well assemble it. All right, same thing, we already did the assembly lube. That's all set. We already got the Loctite on the screws, so that's all set. Usually this is the way to do it, is to get the front corner in, kind of at an angle, like that, and then get the other screw in, and then walk it kind of straight back, and then everybody just drops right in. Easy peasy, right? So same thing, I'm going to run all these 1/2-inch screws down evenly. And then to torque these 1/2-inch bolts, like on this one, you won't be able to get a socket right in there. And then like on the other side, this is a 1/2-inch dog bone. It's got a 1/2-inch, like a 1/2-inch wrench on one side and a 3/8 for your torque wrench. So it just pops on there. All right, so we're gonna go through and torque it down to 18 foot-pounds. So now that she's all torqued down, the next thing to do is to tighten down this breather assembly. And then while we're waiting for this one to bleed down, I'm going to go back to the front and put the gaskets on, and then I can start assembling the top, or the front top rocker box cover. Because I like, even if this thing sat here all night, I like to make sure that the rocker arms can slide back and forth, shoot that little bit of oil on the valve springs, and just know for sure everything's great. So your rocker boxes aren't perfectly square. You'll see that there's these two little lobes here. They fit on the back or on the left hand side, and then there's a little shape here that always goes towards the front. So that one fits on there just like so, and then same way this one just sits on there like so. Then we got the front rocker box cover. Just wiggle that in there. And then I'm just going to speed this up while we're waiting for that one to bleed down. I'm going to put the screws back in this, and we'll keep going. We're double checking, making sure everybody's bled down. They are. Sounds great. Now I just shoot a little bit of lube back there, right on that valve spring. Just because, really. And then our rocker box cover will slide back there. Just like that. And for screws like this, you want to make sure that you put it in first so that you can pull the rocker box cover out a little bit, drop it down, and then she's able to slide right in. When there's really crappy screws like that one, I always put that one towards the top because the gas tank basically covers it up. Just, you know, it'll look a lot better than if you put it way down here. I'm just going to screw her back together. I don't know if I showed it off earlier, but for certain screws like this one, you'll need a 7/16 dog bone, and these torque down to 18 foot-pounds. So I'm just going to put the screws in, tighten them up. So now that we have both of the rocker boxes all put back together and everything's all torqued up, I talked about this breather line earlier. This is a piece of the customer added, but we have that zip tied back in there the way that the customer had it. We put the vehicle back into neutral. Don't forget that you have it in 6th gear, and the spark plugs are back in and they're torqued down. So everything engine wise is all finished up. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the back where it was leaking oil, and anywhere around the rocker boxes that there's oil that's sitting on the engine. And I'm going to use the multi-purpose solvent that we have. It's a alcohol-based cleaner, but I'm just going to spray it down there and get in the back and make sure we rinse all the oil off of it and blow it dry. That way it won't be stinking like it's burning oil anymore. Get the tank and the seat back on. We'll be ready to go. Well, there you have it. We just finished up the rocker box gasket replacement on the 2008. I believe it was an Ultra Classic, but hopefully that answered any questions if you were wondering what to do if you're doing it at home, or why it costs so much labor time if you're getting it done or paying somebody else to do it, but that's the way that I do it. I'm sure that you can slap it back together a whole lot quicker, if you aren't cleaning up the threads and whatever, but like I said, that's the way that I do it. So like and subscribe. That's gonna push me on to the next project that we're gonna be rolling up on the hoist here. But thanks for watching. Bye.